Today, let's do a deep dive into the U.S. Senate election in Nebraska, and we're going to find out if this is a potential dark horse flip for the Democrats, or if it's just a lot of hype and this deep red state is going to easily stay red. And a quick side note, Nebraska is also having a special U.S. Senate election the same time as this regular election. That's the one with former Governor Pete Ricketts. It's a different race. This one is the regular election between Fischer and Osborn. So we'll start on Ballotpedia. We're going to get a little bit of background information. So this seat is currently held by Republican Deb Fischer, and she's running for re-election to a third term. Prior to her time in the Senate, she served in the state legislature. No Democrat actually filed to run in this election, so her only opponent is independent candidate Dan Osborn. Osborn is a mechanic and labor leader, and he's going to serve in place of a regular Democrat as the main opposition to Fischer. He did, however, decline an endorsement from the Dems. So with just those two on the general election ballot, let's see what happened in the primaries. Well, Osborn was able to gather enough signatures, and there's not really anything to take a look at on his side. Deb Fischer, on the other hand, only had mild opposition, and she won her nomination with about 80% of the vote. There was another candidate in this race from the Legal Marijuana Now party, but she has since dropped out and endorsed Dan Osborn. Now, if you want a little bit more background about either of these two candidates, Ballotpedia has a nice summary here of both candidates. Now, let's go down a little bit further and see how this race is rated. As of the last update on September 24th, all four main prediction sites rate this as safe Republican. However, since this last update, I am aware that Larry Sabato has dropped his rating down from safe to likely Republican. My own rating has been safe Republican. I can understand putting it down at likely out of caution. We'll take a look at some other similar cases at the end of the video, but the other race that this reminds me of in this current election cycle is going to be the U.S. Senate election in Maryland. Republicans got their ideal candidate there in Larry Hogan. Now, it's true that Hogan is running as a Republican, not an independent. He probably could run as an independent if he wanted to. He's going to do way better than any other Republican, but in the end, he's very likely to lose, and likely by a comfortable margin. Republicans are hoping he gets lucky and can work some magic somehow, but in the end, it's most likely to be a lot of hype, and that's how I view this race. It's a fairly red state, and even though Deb Fischer is not super popular, there's usually an allure with independent candidates when you're the political underdog in a given state. Osborn is trying to run a more moderate campaign and appeal to popular issues on both sides. He can't alienate too many Republicans because he's going to need to appeal to them if he's going to want to make it close. And given that it's Nebraska, Democrats would pretty much rather have anybody other than Fischer. And even though Osborn is not a true Democrat, if it got rid of Fischer, they would gladly take it. And all Fischer really has to do is remind voters that she's a Republican and it's a Republican state, and theoretically she should at least be able to win, if not by a more comfortable margin. Now, if we go down here, we can take a look at the campaign finance. Fischer does have a lot more raised, but Osborn is hanging in there. More could flow in for him in the final month if it looks like this race could potentially be on the radar. And plus, these numbers are still only updated through the end of June. Now, let's take a closer look at some of these counties on a presidential level. 4 years ago, Trump won this state by about 19 points. Biden did carry the 2nd congressional district, but outside of that, this is a pretty red state. Now, a few of these counties to take a look at are going to be Douglas. This has the major city of Omaha, and about 30% of the population lives here. Back in 2012, Mitt Romney won this county by 3 points. In 16, the support for both candidates was down, but it did flip, and Hillary won it by more than 2. Then last time, it clearly moved toward the left. Biden won it by more than 11 points. So where all the population is, it's got a lot bluer. Now, if you go south of there into Sarpy County, it's more suburban, and last time Trump won it by an 11-point margin. But that's lower than the 15 points he won it by in 16, and a lot lower than the 23 Romney won it by in 12. So a couple of counties here moving toward the left. And how about Lancaster County, which has the capital city of Lincoln? This was narrowly won by Romney in 2012. Hillary flipped it in 16, and last time Biden won it by almost 8. So those could be some warning signs for someone like Deb Fischer if her race ends up being competitive. Now, outside of those counties, let's look at some of these red ones. Not a lot of people live here, but most of these are very, if not extremely, red. Back in 2012, Mitt Romney was already easily getting into the 60s, if not into the 70s. Then once Trump came onto the scene, he was able to make them even redder. His support in these counties sometimes even gets well into the 80s. So this is where the rural vote is actually able to outweigh a lot of that deep blue urban vote. Now, what about Deb Fischer? How did she do in her last run for Senate? Well, here's the 2018 map, and remember, that was a blue wave type of national environment, but she also won by about 19 points against a regular Democrat. She lost Douglas County, but it was by a much smaller margin than Trump lost it. She won Sarpy by 20 points, also far better than Trump did here. And in Lincoln, she lost it by almost 8. That's similar to what Trump did here. But to even it out, some of these deep red counties are just not as red as they were with Trump. So I would say it's easy for this race to get much more competitive than a 19-point margin. But once you start getting down under 10 points, it becomes much more of an uphill climb. Now let's take a quick glance at their official campaign campaign websites. Here it is for Deb Fischer. If you want to hear more about her, take a look at her endorsements, see what she's up to, or support her candidacy. And if you're looking for Dan Osborn, here's his official site. If you're unfamiliar with him, you can read more about him, take a look at his platform, see what he's up to, or support his campaign. Now, what about any debates? Well, something could always change, but this article from early August indicates Deb Fischer has declined to debate, and I'm always disappointed by that, even though I can kind of understand where she's coming from. She thinks she has a big lead and she doesn't want to jeopardize it. The problem is her lead might not be as big as it used to be, and even if it is, I still think the two major candidates should be on the debate stage. So hopefully that changes. If not, maybe it comes back to hurt her, or else maybe it doesn't. We've seen it both ways. Now let's get back on Wikipedia and take a look at the current polling. Now there's not a ton of them, but I would expect there to be more as we get into October. Now most of these were sponsored by Dan Osborn supporters or from the Osborn campaign itself, so keep that in mind. But the most recent one here does have Dan Osborn ahead by 1 point, 45 to 44. That was with 558 likely voters. The other polls on here are very close, but they do start to become outdated pretty quick. Now an easier way to look at this might be getting at 538. Now this shows you more easily who the sponsors of these polls are. Most of them are going to be in support of Osborn, but there is one from the Deb Fischer campaign, and it polled from the exact same days in July as the Osborn poll right underneath. The Osborn poll has it even at 42, but the Fischer poll is not even close, and that one she's up a massive 26. So it's hard to really figure out what's going on with polling here. I think it's easiest to split the difference between those two polls and say Fischer would be up by about 13. That seems much more reasonable. These internal and partisan polls I don't think are all that useful, especially in a wildcard type of race like this. But it is polls like this that have given Democrats some hope. Now there are two semi-recent elections that this race reminds me of. This is a Senate election in a red state and an independent challenger. In 2014 in nearby Kansas, we had a very similar situation. That was incumbent Republican Pat Roberts against independent Greg Orman. Let's take a look at the polling at that race. Well, in September and October, Greg Orman, the independent, was leading in a bunch of these polls. The newer polls are on the bottom, and even the ones right before the election showed this race at least even, if not Orman having a great shot. Now, he wasn't hitting 50% in most of these polls, but still, that gave Democrats some real hope here. But what was the final result? Well, right down below here, we can see that Pat Roberts won by over 10 points. So the polling there really was not useful at all. If you want something more recent, we could go back to just 2 years ago in Utah. Again, another Senate election between Mike Lee, the incumbent Republican, and Evan McMullen, the independent challenger. In this one, the newer polls are toward the top, and the ones that have it the closest are actually ones that are sponsored from the McMullen campaign. That's the one at the top where McMullen trails by only 1, and the one from earlier in October where it shows McMullen with a lead. Now, there might be other examples out there, and every race is unique, but in the end, usually support for independent candidates seems most appealing before an election. On election day, usually the partisan lean of the state kicks in, and in these cases, more Republicans came home and put their candidate over the top. So the best guess is the Nebraska situation would be similar in the end. It's far from guaranteed, but it seems more likely than not. Now, the last thing we're going to do is get on Polymarket and see where people are putting their money. This has the Republican candidate over 80%, other which is Dan Osborn, the independent candidate, he's under 20%. So with all that said, what is the conclusion here for Nebraska? It's a red state. Trump won this by 19 points. That's not at all close. Fischer's last win in a blue wave was also by a 19-point margin. There are some pockets of blue areas in the state, and Fischer is not the greatest candidate, and there is some appeal with Osborn being an independent. That could bring over some more moderate Republicans, and Fischer is going to have to take this threat seriously. Even though in the special election, Pete Ricketts should win that more comfortably, Fischer should not take anything for granted. Her not debating, I think, is a bad move, but the state is red enough to where I would think that Fischer could pretty much do almost anything she wants and still pull out at least a narrow win. There's still a little bit of time to go. Maybe Dan Osborn does have a late surge. There's potential here for a dark horse storyline to develop, like Republicans in Maryland that are thinking Hogan could potentially flip it under the right circumstances. Democrats also seem to be bullish here about having a pickup here that's not really on most people's radar. In the end, the most likely scenario is Fischer is going to win it. It could easily be over 10 points yet again, but it's possible it does get down under 10. The potential for flipping does seem at least unlikely at this point, but we're going to follow it and see what happens. So that's a deep dive into the Nebraska Senate election. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about this race? Do you think Democrats are hyped up here for no reason and Fischer is going to walk away with this? Or do you think Fischer is complacent and there's an opening for Dan Osborn to potentially have a flip in this race? Let me know down below on your way out. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Join if you'd like to support the channel. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.